Hello everyone, welcome to this new video on Jacko Productions. My name is Daniel Plainview and I'm an oil man. And today we're going to talk about this infamous movie, There Will Be Blood, directed by P.T. Anderson and starring Daniel Day-Lewis.
To be more precise, we are going to delve into the concept of the uncanny, or uncanniness, as understood by famous German philosopher Martin Heidegger. Various themes in There Will Be Blood are very much in line with his ideas regarding the moods related to the uncanny. Also, the main character of Daniel Plainview, with all his emotions and choices, seems to express the anxiety, the idea of Dasein, who is in flight for itself.
So, let's drain this milkshake.
There Will Be Blood is loosely based on Upton Sinclair's novel Oil from 1927. The film version has been considered P.T. Anderson's magnum opus, and for good reasons. This film truly captivates the historical time in which it is set, namely during the Southern California's oil boom of the late 19th and early 20th century. The film follows Daniel Plainview, starting from 1898, when he is a silver prospector in the US up until the year 1927. Around that time he has become a true oilman, possessing a huge amount of land and oil. And this ladder to success did not go entirely without a fight. For instance, while digging for silver, he breaks his leg thanks to a painful fall. His alleged son, H.W. Plainview, goes deaf due to an accident at the Little Boston oil well. And worst of all, he is confronted by a spiritual young man named Eli, who is taunting Daniel. This young man demands $5,000 for the establishment of his church, as was promised by Daniel in exchange for the land. Daniel refused to pay up, probably out of a certain pride and a desire for wealth. Both men are in fact each other's mirror. Both Daniel and Eli pretend to be charitable people. Daniel claims that through the oil well of Little Boston, he can provide the village with money, bread and education, whereas Eli claims that he is an emissary of God, sent to teach the residents about the Bible and to heal the people through the power of faith. Behind their facades lies the desire to generate power and to gain control over one's own life and that of others. An important aspect of the character of Daniel Plainview is his determination. This is of course also an important element of the economy, work hard and gain profit. Plainview shows tremendous willpower throughout the film, motivated by his embedded desire to make as much money as possible. His motives are partially exposed during a conversation with his supposed half-brother, Henry, in which Plainview speaks of his personal hatred towards people in general. And he gradually has built up this hatred over the years as a result of a competition inside of him. Hence, he decides to earn such an amount of money in order to rid himself of everyone. And he ends these words with the realization that he cannot do this alone. A contradiction. During his journey towards financial success and independence, he repels the small number of people that he does care about, including his alleged half-brother and alleged son. And one might argue that the character of Daniel Plainview is in line with some of the writings of Nietzsche concerning acting out of self-interest, and that the film as a whole seems to connect with the Protestant work ethic postulated by Max Weber. Such themes tie in quite well with the ideas concerning anxiety as understood by Martin Heidegger, especially knowing that There Will Be Blood is all about Dasein in a flight for itself. Daniel Plainview is a Dasein that is constantly being pursued by the uncanniness, Unheimlichkeit, and threatens its everyday lostness in the day, although not explicitly. The work, Sein und Zeit, was published in 1927 by the philosopher Martin Heidegger, when he was just 37 years of age. The work itself is rather complex and filled with words created or altered by the author himself, with the obvious intent to capture the things that language alone is not able to grasp. One term he uses quite often in Sein und Zeit, time and being, is the term Dasein. This term does have multiple meanings which are all connected with one another, but for the sake of clarity, Dasein will be understood as a being which is related understandingly in its being toward that being. Dasein exists. By stating that Dasein exists, Heidegger makes us aware that Dasein is the being which I myself always am. Heidegger doesn't have a linear conception of time in which the present is carried by the past and received by the future, He considers time as successive moments. Heidegger states that Dasein is caged by what he calls the day. The notion of the day is comparable with the general masses in our society, since the masses try to control life in the world by making everything manageable, intelligible and framed. This also means that the day makes the unusual usual, by clarifying and framing things such as death and life without having any true knowledge on these matters. And this is what Heidegger calls tranquilized familiarity. Heidegger argues that we can speak of the falling prey of Dasein, meaning that Dasein is in a flight from himself. This is actually a flight from not being at home, that is, from the uncanniness which lies in Dasein as throne, as being in the world entrusted to itself in its being. This fleeing happens all the time. Heidegger states that the everydayness of this fleeing shows phenomenally that anxiety, as a fundamental kind of attunement, belongs to Dasein. There are two scenes in There Will Be Blood that connect well with the individualism of Heidegger's philosophy. Both scenes should be seen as a whole, since they both share the same abstract form. The scenes to be discussed are the opening scene, which almost takes 15 minutes of screen time, and the scene in which Daniel realized that Henry wasn't honest about his kinship with Daniel, and that he actually isn't his half-brother. The opening scene starts with a black screen and the ominous string music by Johnny Greenwood, followed by the title, which appears in a hard cut and also disappears in the same manner. The strings make a crescendo and the black screen fades into an establishing shot of the Californian dry landscape with 3 distinct hills, followed by a hard cut of Daniel Plainview cutting stone with a pick hammer in a deep hole in the ground. Eventually, Daniel Plainview finds silver in the stone and decides to use dynamite in order to acquire it. However, when he tries to retrieve his equipment and the silver, he falls down from the ladder and breaks his leg. Despite this setback, the crippled Daniel still climbs out of the pit and crawls towards civilization. The string music returns, together with a re-establishing shot of the dry landscape with the hills. The shots aren't entirely fixed. With the use of handheld camera work, Daniel Plainview and other men are framed while they drain oil with a primitive pump jack. The grim string music remains, which seems to accentuate the dangers, the filth and foul that lie in this field of work. The scene ends when a worker dies during an accident, leaving his baby son behind. It is a touching moment to see how Daniel takes this boy under his wing. This moment makes Daniel more humane and shows that this character does seem to care for the ones around him. The second scene to be discussed connects very well with the opening scene. In this scene we follow Daniel Plainview and his half-brother Henry when they arrive at the ocean after they have measured the pipeline for the oil. Daniel almost possesses all the lands needed for the pipeline, except for one lot. One Mr. Bandy refused to sell his lands, and that's why Daniel and Henry want to pay him a visit. First, both men decide to take a swim, and after that they dry up on the beach. The ominous music makes its appearance again, and while they talk about the past and their childhood, Daniel suggests to go for a drink somewhere in the evening to have some fun. Henry responds quite unenthusiastic, and this seems to trigger Daniel negatively. The camera frames in close-up the face of Daniel while pondering. This is followed by a medium long shot in which Daniel and Henry are framed from the side while they sit on the ground at the beach. In terms of mise-en-scène, what is most interesting is the placement of both these characters. Henry sits in a fragile position, with his head lowered, well in the shadows. He is closest to the camera, whereas Daniel sits next to him, a little more forward, completely visible in the sunlight. The created image expresses a literal contrast between the two characters, as if Henry is merely a shadow of Daniel. The image also seems to symbolize the idea that Henry is the personification of Daniel's personal inner struggles concerning his past. This inner part of Daniel is precisely the thing from which he tries to run away. This suggestion has been answered in the same shot quite literally, when Daniel leaves Henry in the shadows and walks out of the frame towards the ocean. The string music is getting louder while the film cuts to a long shot in which Daniel is swimming whilst he's watching Henry. We can almost see the anger in Daniel's eyes. What follows is the moment when both men are at the bar. Henry is laughing with a woman and seems to be quite drunk, and he asks Daniel for some extra money to buy some more drinks. The camera zooms in on Daniel's angry face, staring at Henry, while the music makes a crescendo. This shot ends with a fade out followed by an out of focus point of view shot from Henry's perspective, emphasizing the current unclear state in which he is in. The image becomes gradually sharper until we see the face of Daniel holding a pistol. The music softens, yet remains. However, for a moment the tense music changes into a more lovely sound. It is night time, and Henry and Daniel both are camped outside in the wilderness. Henry confesses that he is not his half-brother, but that he used to know him before he died of tuberculosis. Henry used the diary of Daniel's half-brother in order to get a purpose in his life, in order to get closer to Daniel as a friend pretending to be his brother. Daniel is furious, and without hesitation he shoots Henry in the head, and after some unpleasant struggles, Henry dies. The string music swells up again, and we see how Daniel is using a pick hammer to plow the soil in order to dig a hole for the body of Henry. Both the previous scene and this scene share the same musical and visual elements. The character of Daniel Plainview is framed in a medium long shot, while he performs hard labor, using the pick hammer. The menacing string music seems to express the essential theme of the story itself, fleeing from oneself through hard labor, whereas in the first scene it seems that hard work was carried out in order to achieve certain success. In the case of this scene, it seems as if nothing has been achieved. After burying the body of Henry, Daniel decides to rest. He takes his half-brother's diary that Henry carried and starts reading from it, and in it he finds an old picture of a young boy, probably his half-brother or himself. Daniel snaps and cannot hold his emotions any longer. He starts crying, and it's one of the only moments in the whole film that we as an audience see the sincerity in the emotions of Daniel Plainview. Note that he is completely alone at night while in this emotional conflict. This seems to symbolize the loneliness, and it explains to what extent his emotions have been suppressed. Prior to this, Daniel Plainview never showed his true emotions, always seeming to be in control, yet remaining slightly tempered. The nervous and irritable nature of Daniel seems to resemble the uncanny mood that relates to anxiety. Heidegger clearly states that the physiological triggering of anxiety is possible only because of Dasein is anxious in the very ground of its being. One might argue that throughout the whole film, Daniel is fleeing from the uncanny feeling related to anxiety by working hard and focusing on financial and materialistic wealth, or by numbing himself through alcohol abuse. It seems as if the tensed and uncanny music is an expression of anxiety itself, from which Daniel tries to run away. In that sense, Daniel Plainview seems to be the expression of the restless nature of the Western people, and the related philosophical and economic ideologies in general. What makes the scene so remarkable is that it is the only scene in the whole film that truly seems to reveal eigentliche anxiety. Heidegger argues that for the most part, the mood of uncanniness remains existentially uncomprehended, and that with the dominance of falling prey and publicness, real anxiety is rare. However, Heidegger assumes that the rarity of the phenomenon is an indication of the fact that Dasein, which mostly remains concealed from itself in its authenticity, because of the way things get publicly interpreted by the they, can be disclosed in a primordial sense in its fundamental attunement. The moment when Daniel no longer is able to control his emotions, when he no longer can flee from himself, is actually the disclosure of anxiety. After this scene, the film takes an unexpected twist. Initially, it makes sense to assume that Daniel is neglecting his motivations now that he is faced with anxiety. Surprisingly, the complete opposite occurs. When Daniel wakes up, he is confronted by Mr. Bandy, the man who didn't want to sell his land. However, Bandy seems to know of the crime that Daniel has committed earlier that night, yet he is willing to sell his land and to remain silent if and only if Daniel is willing to let himself be baptized at the Church of Eli. Of course, Daniel accepts this proposal, meaning that he can continue his plans for the pipeline. And once again, Daniel can outrun the anxiety. It is as if fate doesn't want Daniel to embrace anxiety. Knowing this explains why the film There Will Be Blood feels like a certain confrontation. It reveals this human sense of anxiety, especially when looking at the main character of Daniel Plainview. He expresses this deep sense of anxiety, which we all have felt. Those moments in which we couldn't bear ourselves, but also couldn't bear others.
I hope you enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe for more on Jacko Productions.